Formed just a few days after the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918, the Canadian Air Force was fated to have a precarious, unsettled, and temporary existence. The idea was to form the CAF around a corps of about 50 very experienced officers, many of them highly decorated, and a few hundred well-trained ground crew, and equipped at no cost with up to 100 former RAF aircraft given as a gift to Canada. The whole force was to be shipped back to Canada, lock, stock, and barrel. But this was not to be. The political mood at home had changed. No one in the government wanted to spend even modest amounts of money on an air force. The CAF was formally disbanded in February 1920. Many of the airmen stayed in England and took up commissions offered to them in the RAF. Others were demobilized and came back to Canada. The result was a frittering away of valuable manpower, training, and equipment resources, which had cost millions to consolidate and would cost millions to recreate at a later date. A similar fate awaited the first Royal Canadian Naval Air Service, which had become operational on the 5th of September 1918. It was temporarily disbanded for more than a quarter century, not reforming until 1946. These were the cream of as many as 13,000 Canadian combat flyers who flew in the air services, along with many thousands more maintainers.
One of the great gifts of the First World War was this enormous basis of airmen who had been trained and who were good pilots. Not all of them stayed in the business, but enough did that you had the nucleus on which to build. The CAF was an attempt to develop a Canadian Air Force in line with what had been developed in the way of military aviation during the First World War. The best way in which to build up air power, if you're going to use air power, is not simply to build a military aviation corps. You need to build up the infrastructure on which aviation works. So you had to have the industry, you had to have the equipment, you had to have the training and the men. Well, you had elements of all that from the First World War.
In its early years, the CAF concentrated on pioneering aviation in an array of civilian-oriented tasks: forest patrols and fighting fires, aerial mapping, surveying and photography, medical rescue flights, and ice patrols. In addition, the CAF was responsible for overseeing the development of the entire field of Canadian aviation, everything from registering civil aircraft, supervising aircraft design and construction, and helping to create a national network of interconnected airfields along the populated southern latitudes of the country. Very little was done in the way of military flight training, although in May of 1923, the first course of provisional pilot officers began at Camp Borden. They were the first new pilots to be trained in Canada since the end of the war. It did, however, maintain something of its military identity. From the beginning, the force granted its own commissions, wore its own light blue uniforms, and used RAF ranks, ensign, and motto. In early 1923, the Royal Sobriquet was applied for and granted. And on the 1st of April, 1924, King's Regulations and Orders for the RCAF came into effect. Its permanent force component had an establishment of 66 officers and 194 airmen. As far as the general public was concerned, it was suspicious of flying and particularly amazed by aerobatics. With the delivery in 1927 and 28 of 8 Armstrong Whitworth Siskins, the possibility of creating an RCAF formation flying team was raised by headquarters and taken up enthusiastically by the pilots and crews at Camp Borden. In 1931, the Siskins were the high point of a Trans-Canada air pageant and flew some 35 shows at airfields right across the country. Canada, indeed North America, could no longer assume immunity from attack from the air simply because of the transoceanic distances separating the continents. And naval forces on their own could not possibly ensure protection because of the speed and surprise with which air raids could be mounted.
The Chief of General Staff, General McNaughton at the time, was very conscious of the importance of the air weapon in carrying out Canadian defense policy, that the only way you could respond quickly to a threat on either of our coasts was by air.
Major General A.G.L. McNaughton became a champion of air power and soon launched a set of new planning initiatives. By the summer of 1932, a staff officer at Air Force Headquarters had completed a draft plan. The primary role of the new military-oriented RCAF was to be home, essentially coastal defense. A secondary role would be participation in an expeditionary force for service overseas. But the need for new equipment was becoming acute. Between 1930 and 1935, the RCAF wrote off 143 aircraft because of crashes or because their age made them unsafe to fly. In 1936, the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, wrote,
"As a Canadian citizen, I owe it to our country to protect it in a mad world, both on sea and in the air. But we owe it to ourselves and subsequent generations to lay foundations on which they will have to build."
Later that year, the RCAF's share of the federal budget was tripled, although it was still woefully inadequate for anything more than basic equipment and some operational training. Nevertheless, by early in 1937, after a somewhat desultory debate in Parliament, the RCAF was formally given primary responsibility for the direct defense of the country.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
The Munich crisis of September 1938 concentrated military planners' minds wonderfully, and the inadequacy of Canada's air defenses became all too apparent. It was quickly realized that the RCAF had to be transformed, and fast, into an efficient and modern military organization. Available resources were hardly up to the task. The 150 officers and fewer than 1,000 airmen, with an additional 600 in the reserve, and 39 obsolete military aircraft, of which only 12 could carry effective bomb loads, would scarcely have presented a credible deterrent, even to the most faint-hearted enemy. It was, to put it bluntly, in a dreadful state. None of the RCAF's 11 permanent force squadrons, let alone its 12 auxiliary ones, were sufficiently manned, equipped, or free from civil aviation tasks to be able to concentrate on a training program for its wartime establishment. The immediate priority of the CAS, Air Commodore G.M. Croyle, was to equip his 9 permanent squadrons assigned to coastal defense at least with modern aircraft. The first 5 of an eventual 40 Supermarine Stranraer flying boats had been ordered from Canadian Vickers in 1936. This relatively modern aircraft was designed to fulfill the long-range coastal reconnaissance role. It carried a crew of 6 and had a range of about 1,000 miles. 2 of them were hurried into service with 5 Squadron in late 1938. Croyle ordered another 7 of those right away, along with 18 Westland Wapitis, 13 Blackburn Sharks, and a number of Bristol Bolingbrooks and Westland Lysanders. Canadian conditions required a twin-engine 2-seater with sufficient range and endurance to enable it to overfly vast undeveloped territory with some degree of safety, and later long-range maritime patrol aircraft. Nevertheless, in June of 1939, RCAF pilots showed up on the Vancouver docks and took delivery of 10 brand new Hawker Hurricane monoplane fighters. Apart from the problem of purchasing modern aircraft in sufficient numbers, the Air Force had to think about establishing air stations, support services, and communications over vast distances and sometimes rugged terrain. Air Force General Order No. 2 in 1938 decentralized command and control and established Western Air Command at Vancouver, Eastern Air Command at Halifax, and Air Training Command at Toronto.
When rearmament began, the government of the day recognized that it was necessary to build up our air strength, perhaps more than any other aspect of the rearmament process. The recognition was there that we would have to expand quickly. When in 1939 war was declared, we managed to get some aircraft from the United States anyway, before the United States neutrality laws prevented any further export of military material from the United States to Canada.
In early September 1939, the world held its breath and waited for war. No. 1 Squadron's Hurricanes arrived in Halifax, and the ancient Wapatis of No. 3 staggered in. The only fully operational airbase on Canada's east coast was Dartmouth Seaplane Station, and the only really operational unit was No. 5 Squadron, with its handful of Stranraer flying boats. By the 4th of September, the whole Air Force, including auxiliary squadrons and reserves, was placed on active service. Total strength barely topped 4,000. We had 53 serviceable aircraft, most of them already obsolete or converted from civil use.